I come from a Turkish Cypriot family, born in London, grew up in London, in Stoke Newington. Yeah, growing up was, I lived two lives. I lived the life at home. So my parents were Turkish. They spoke Turkish in the home. I've got two older sisters. I didn't learn Turkish, so I was I was learning, I was speaking Turkish at home, but very badly. And as I grew up, I started to speak English more and more. And eventually, I spoke purely in English. And if my parents spoke to me in Turkish, I kind of I answered in English and actually realised at some stage that I thought in English. And so I lived two lives, one life based on our culture at home and the other based on just being an ordinary kid, growing up, having friends, going to school. Life was always a bit tough, but that was normal. I mean, I grew up in an area where life seemed to be tough for everyone, but there was enough, kind of joy. There was playing out with your friends, going to school. As I got older, that play turned into taking risks. Those risks were characterised by sometimes getting into trouble. And then there was a real clash between my culture and the prevailing culture. Whereas, some of my friends could stay out late, but if I stayed out late, it drew a response from my dad or from my mum. When I was quite young, my dad went to prison, so he wasn't around when I was very young, when between sort of 3 and 8 or 9. But when he got back, life was very different. My growing up, it was me, my mum, and my sisters, and life was quite idyllic at times. When my dad came home from prison, I realised that there was real tension. For instance, my parents didn't sleep in the same room. My dad lived downstairs and my mum was upstairs. When my dad wasn't with us when I was younger, we would visit him in prison, and I didn't know what a prison was, and so we would visit him in this loud, clangy, bangy sort of institution. I was too young to remember why my dad went to prison. He actually went to prison because he killed someone in our house. I was told about that later on. And while we were visiting him in prison, I only remember this because later on, as a 40-year-old, I know I'm jumping ahead a bit, I worked in a prison and I had a flashback in that prison to visiting my dad there when I must have been about 6 or 7, maybe 8 tops. And it was in the closed visits area of Wormwood Scrubs. I was the area drug coordinator for the London prisons, and I remember going in there as an adult with a suit on, with keys, with other prison officers. And I had this flashback that I'd been here before, and I nearly cried. It was embarrassing. I didn't know what to do. When I came home, I told my wife. But it relates back to a moment when I was much younger, and I was visiting my dad with another relative, and that relative got assaulted in the closed prison, in the closed visits area, by another prisoner's visitors. And this was all to do with the trouble that my dad was in, the kind of family dispute, the fact that he'd killed this person. There was a relative in the prison and they couldn't get to him, but they got to someone that was visiting him. And whilst I don't remember all of that in terms of the detail around it, what I remember was being a little boy, being in the middle of this violent episode and seeing the blood. And that stayed with me and obviously got buried until, it sounds preposterous to say this, until I was 40 and I went back into that space, and then it triggered that experience again. Another experience that from my childhood that I remember is after my dad got back from prison, one day he came upstairs and he put my mum's stuff outside the front door and wouldn't let her in. And I remember we used to have our sitting room upstairs, and so she was banging on the door saying, you know, kind of let me in, what's my stuff doing here? But the tables had turned in the house. My dad was taking control. And I remember him saying to me, I dare you to let her in. And I was rooted to my seat. I couldn't move. I thought if I let her in, he's going to hurt her. And I was scared of my dad. And I just sat there, didn't move. And she finished shouting and obviously went off. But I remember it vividly. And so I realised, you know, so there was this kind of idyllic life peppered with traumatic memories of things that had happened. And so I kind of took that with me into later life. And yeah, it was weird. I walked around hypervigilant, scared, worried about stuff that's going on at home, always trying to keep everyone happy and together. And it never really, I couldn't really do it. And so, yeah, I just found it, growing up, just to me, that the stuff that I remember that was good was school, was going to Sunday school. I went to an Anglican primary school. We went to Sunday school on Sundays, not with our parents' knowledge, but because there was a van that used to come around and pick up all the sort of waifs and stray kids playing on the streets and take you to Sunday school, teach you Bible stories, then drop you home. You know, and that was it. And they drop you home with a little tract to give your parents, which I would take in, but it never, you know, my mum couldn't read English really. When my dad came out of prison and we were still doing this, he put a stop to it and said, you know, you're not doing that anymore. In fact, I had to stop doing anything religious at school because it was a kind of high Anglican primary school, and I had to do extra English lessons. So I had to sit on my own with a teacher while everyone else went to some form of mass or service. And it wasn't about what I believed then, it was just about being excluded and being separated. As I got a bit older, I mean, other trauma, I mean, it's not all trauma. I think the trauma that I can remember is things that happened that are memorable, but it was peppered with lots of normality. And I think maybe it's just the trauma that stands out. So when I was coming to the end of primary school, my mum, who had moved on from my dad, she'd ended up meeting someone else, she'd moved to Cyprus, came back one day and offered to take me shopping. And so I went with her. I was a bit nervous that if she stayed in the house too long, my dad would come home and he would catch her. And instead of going shopping, we got on a plane to Cyprus that night, which left my two sisters in a very precarious position because my dad was quite an angry man. But I ended up in Cyprus. And I was there for 6 months before a series of events, and my dad came and took me back, forcibly took me back from Cyprus and brought me back to England. And I went back to primary school, not as if nothing had happened, but almost being told to act as if nothing had happened. But I'd had this kind of mad interlude of going to Cyprus and coming back and all that happened in between. I first realised that something was different about me when I found other people that were similar to me. I kind of moved through life. I was quite clever at school. I wasn't very academic, but I was clever. I liked solving problems. I did well at school up to a certain point. I was very good at sports. I mixed with others reasonably easily. But they weren't the mainstream people. I tried to become friends with the mainstream people, and I did that up to a point. You know, after school we had this amazing teacher. I've got to name him. His name was Keith Ajegbo. I think he's a bigwig in the educational world now, but at the time he was this English teacher that played tennis with us after school. And I never made it all the way to, I made it to the end of school, but I never carried on with college. So I left school with a sort of smattering of qualifications. They're nothing major. Not that great at maths. Wonderful, really good at English literature. Not so good at English language in terms of the grammar and all the rest of it. But had a real sense of, what do I do next? I'm not sure. And I drifted into this kind of world where problem solving seemed to be really, really valued. I tried to get a job. I didn't have lots of qualifications, so any job that I did get was starting at quite a basic level. And I never seemed to progress to a point where I could really settle in a job. But when it came to shortcuts, and particularly crime, problem solving was really useful. And so I found that committing crime, I didn't see it as, I'm not some big time criminal. I was a small, opportunistic person, but I found ways to, buck the system, and I thought I was clever, and that led me into a world that introduced me to drugs. First drug I ever took was tobacco, was a cigarette, and I remember being sick after my first cigarette, and then carrying on even though I'd been sick. Alcohol wasn't a big feature, although I did drink from time to time, and cannabis as well. I could take it or leave it. I wasn't. It wasn't something that I needed to do all the time, and I guess life progressed in a series of experimentations, trying different drugs, mainly pills, until I stumbled on heroin. And I remember being really frightened of the word. It's a bit like someone using the word cancer, it just quietens the room. If you say heroin at the time, and this was in the 80s, I thought to myself, I had a picture of a Fagin type, person who's going to offer it to me in an alleyway and was going to be clearly up to no good. When I first encountered it, it was actually in someone's living room, and it was a good friend that offered it to me. The big change came when I discovered that the feeling it gave me inside quelled all of the noise in my head, all of the hypervigilance that I had. I suddenly relaxed, and I suddenly felt like everyone else. Well, like how I thought everyone else felt. I felt comfortable in my own skin. I felt okay. I was sick again, but the sickness didn't stop me doing it again. And we were smoking it. We weren't injecting it. And I look back on that. I've been in recovery a lot longer than I've been in active addiction. And I look back on that time now, and my perception of it has changed. That time was when I first made a discovery that there was something that could make me feel better. And so I wanted to keep using it, keep doing it again and again. But I was still scared of it. And what I found was I kind of played around with it for 3 or 4 months, maybe 6 months tops, before it was established in my life, and I felt like I needed it every day. And suddenly, work options, life in the normal lane wasn't going to happen for me. I was going to be using drugs, committing crime, living this alternative lifestyle. And there were enough people around me that were doing similar things. And every now and then we touched into the real world. For instance, there was a period where, I really loved music at the time. We had, where I was growing up, we had a sound system. So there was a few of us as friends. I was a white face in a black crowd. I'm Turkish, and so it wasn't that I was seen as English, although if you just looked at a photo of me and my friends, it was a white face in a black crowd, and so we played soul music, reggae music, all sorts on our sound system, and that put me in touch with normal people. So we were, we were playing music at the youth centre, we were going to parties and playing music there. And for a while it was really normal. There was cannabis, there was alcohol, but there wasn't the degree of crime and Class A drugs as before. But I couldn't maintain myself in that world, and gradually I drifted away from that and drifted into other things. And yeah, I guess I realised that this substance that was making me feel different also brought with it some problems, and those problems started to manifest themselves over time. I remember once being, on many occasions, being without money and without drugs and being desperate and walking around looking for an opportunity, for some reason in my mind, often in the rain. So you're just in this aimless position where you're trying to get money to buy drugs in order to feel differently, in order to feel better. And I remember that must have happened to me once too many times, and I decided I need to somehow get out of this pattern of living. And I didn't know how I was going to do it. Now, the guy that used to drive the van to take us to Sunday school when I was little, he was still in my life. His name was John, and John would stay connected to me by coming and visit me at random times and giving me a book, or giving me a video, like a VHS video, and saying, have a look at that, and I'll come back and see you in a couple of weeks and we'll have a chat. He took me to, it was like a rally. It's called a Nicky Cruz rally. Nicky Cruz was this guy that was in the books that he was giving me. He gave me a book called The Cross and the Switchblade, and it was about the Mau Mau gang in New York, and how the leader of that gang, Nicky Cruz, and his deputy, Israel Navarez, a guy called David Wilkinson went to New York and started to reach out to these people in this gang. And he was a church minister, and he felt this was what God had told him to do. So I read this book and I was fascinated by it, because it seemed like a million miles away from where I was, and New York was this amazing place. And he came to Ealing in London, and he was doing this rally. So John said, would you like to go? And I said, yeah. And I remember going to it and being really moved by him, not because of what he said necessarily, just by the personality of him and his presence, because he is Puerto Rican, so I could hardly understand what he was saying. He was speaking in a form of English, but it was heavily accented in a Puerto Rican way. And I remember he got through to me somehow, because he was someone who, whilst I hadn't lived the life that he'd led, he was like a sort of major gang leader, and he'd committed crime, and crime in New York always seems more glamorous than crime in like a wet and rainy North London sort of suburb. But something got through to me, and I remember thinking, it's possible. I don't know how to get from here to there, but I know that I can get from here to there. And so suddenly all this kind of thinking broke out in me. I spoke to my friends. I mean, I carried on using drugs, but I kept saying to them, I met this amazing guy and blah, blah, blah. It didn't change the course of my life, but it changed the course of my thinking. John remained in touch, and he had a number for a rehab. And so I must have been, we've shot forward, I must be 22, 23. My dad was ill. Eventually my dad died, and that I kind of sunk a bit deeper into that life of crime and using drugs and all of that. And yeah, he had this number, and I thought, I'm going to give it a try. And so I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that I'd had enough and I wanted to make a change. And so John organised it. He spoke to the rehab. We went and visited it, and they said, yeah, we can take you, but it's going to take a while. It's going to be at least, I think, 6 to 10 weeks to get in. And we'll get in touch with you, sort of thing. And so I had to then think, okay, I'm still using drugs every day at this point. So how do I stop? And back then, there wasn't the infrastructure of treatment that there is now. And so most people that I know, and I did it a few times myself involuntarily, they clucked it out. You just stayed at home and you just stopped using, and you climbed the walls for a bit. You had diarrhea, you felt sick. It was like a bad case of the flu. But I ended up going to my sister's flat. I ripped a few people off when I did that, and that wasn't deliberate. It was just kind of where I was at the time. I just walked away from my life, and I had stuff that belonged to other people, and that acted as a deterrent. It meant I couldn't go back, because if I went back, I'd be in trouble. These aren't the sort of people that you could mess about with. And so I was stuck, and I didn't even take the gear with me. I gave it away. And so, it's a bit like I read later on in life, the Spanish conquistadors, when they went to South America, they sometimes burnt the ships and broke the cooking pots and said to the crew, the only way is forward. It felt like that, it felt like I burnt my bridges and I needed to go forward. And then I immediately started shitting myself, thinking, what have I done, kind of thing. But I eventually got into rehab and managed to get to a point where I could start to realise that change. Because up until the moment I walked in, and even for the first few weeks there, it was all a bit of a game, it was a bit of a fantasy. But suddenly that was becoming real, because now I had a means to get from A to B. And so, I kind of took it on from there. So I got into this treatment centre called Yeldall Manor, and it was a Christian place, a faith-based residential rehabilitation centre for men. It wasn't treatment in the way that I understand treatment today, in that we didn't do any therapy. It was a wonderful big house, big rooms, huge grounds, 40 acres, woodland. The drive is amazing. It's about a quarter of a mile, maybe even half a mile, tree-lined pathway full of massive California redwoods. And then you get there and you see the house, and it's a house from the kind of, 1850s, something like that, maybe older. But there was counselling. There wasn't therapy except what they would call fellowship. So we had fellowship, which was singing hymns, kind of more modern day Christian songs. We had what we would call teachings, which are like groups, and that would be looking at the Bible, drawing parallels from that to modern day living. There were some topics that we covered, things like security, self-worth and significance, and how do we get these things into our lives? Where does it come from? Where does our security come from? Where does our significance and self-worth come from? But it was run by these people that tried to live out what they were teaching. And so they were inspirational and annoying as well, because, I used to, the way my character is, the way my makeup is that and maybe this is true of all people that are going through a process of change, but I wanted to push the boundaries. And so initially, and I knew the Bible reasonably well. I'd been to Sunday school, as a child, and the Bible wasn't unfamiliar to me. But I found myself wanting to know about it so that I could disrupt the teachings, so I could find the question that would make the tutor stumble or fall or get annoyed, and they never did. We had structure. We got up at the same time every day. We had breakfast. We had to be showered and shaved and our rooms cleaned by a certain time. So there was a little bit of boot camp about it. Everything was governed by a bell. So a bell went for everything that happened. You know, bell goes and you've got to be somewhere within 15 minutes. And then the second bell goes and you've got to be there within a minute. And so you became trained by this bell to respond. But the structure was something I wasn't used to. I just did what I wanted every day until I got there. And so suddenly I found myself in this world of treatment that was unfamiliar to me, but there was community life and there was learning to live again. The life of most drug users is characterised by wearing many different hats. And so sometimes I would be using drugs as a punter. Sometimes I'd be selling drugs as someone who needed to get their bit for free. So you would be, be the one going and buying on behalf of your friends. And sometimes, you'd be running from the police because you've done something wrong, or you'd be running from other drug users because you'd ripped them off. So life was, before I got to Yeldal, it wasn't a 9 to 5. And suddenly here I was trying to live a 9 to 5 in a treatment centre, going to church on Sundays. And so some of the obstacles for me were that I didn't feel like the people that were there. I identified with the other residents up to a point, because when they started telling their kind of war stories about their drug use and their past and the amount of years they spent in prison, I didn't have similar war stories. I never went to prison. I never injected. I just smoked. I came from a different cultural background to many of the people there. And so for a while I didn't feel like I belonged there. I felt like a bit of an imposter. I actually went to my counsellor after a while and said, I think I need to leave this place and give my bed up for someone who's worse than me, because I'm not as bad as these lot. And they just laughed at me. They kind of said, you're as bad as anyone else. You know better, no worse. And I remember talking to my big sister at the time, saying, can I come home? This isn't for me. And she said, you can do what you want. You're an adult. I was 23, 24 by then. She said, you just can't come back here. So it's up to you what you want to do. So I stayed. And eventually, I must have got there in the April of 86. And by the sort of Christmas of 86, I relapsed. I went home with another resident. We colluded with each other to buy drugs, and we took them, and then we went back. And I remember telling one of my other peers, another resident, that what I'd done, and he said, he listened, and he was he was nodding along and being very empathetic, and then he said, "You got 24 hours to tell them, or I'm going to tell them for you, because you don't need to be. If you want to be going off and doing that, go and do it. Don't waste your time here." And so I had to sleep on it, and the next day I fessed up, and the other guy didn't want to fess up, and so I fessed up alone. So I was lying even when I was fessing up to what I'd done, and that guy finished the program, and I was on kitchen duties when he was being, collecting his certificate and his pat on the back and all the rest of it, and I was really resentful. And that's another thing that I struggled with. I used to be resentful quite a lot. I used to take things personally. I used to fantasize about, how unjust things were and what I should do about it. But what that place taught me, and what my peers taught me, was, what goes on inside your head isn't always helpful. It's not a reliable indicator of what's really going on. And so we coined this term that the change used to take place in the tea room, not in the counselling room. The counselling was important, talking to your counsellor about things that had happened, and he would help you to process them. But your peers in the tea room would tell you the truth. They'd challenge you. They'd mock you, they'd give you that third-party perspective that could be relied on. And over time, I redid the program, because when I fessed up, they said, well, clearly something hasn't taken. The change that you thought that you were experiencing wasn't change. You were deluding yourself. So the only thing we know to do is either to kick you out or start again. And so I had to start again. I chose to start again, and it wasn't like a sort of fake starting again. You were treated like it was your first day. So you had to go and have a shower. You had to go and get your bag searched. You got your room searched. You lost your nice room that you'd earned through compliance with the program, and you went back to a shared room. And yeah, it was literally back to square one. And it was phase one, day one, week one. So you had no phone privileges. There was no mobile phones then, but you couldn't phone home. You couldn't you couldn't do any letters. If you go to town, you're going to be accompanied by a member of staff. You're not going to have your own money. So it was. I don't think it was meant to be humiliating, but you had to do it in front of the whole community. And so, again, what that taught me was, you're not special. When I first came out of treatment and started to live life again, I still had that sharp, reactionary, bit of a Jack the Lad approach. And I remember when we first moved into this house, we had some neighbours over the back there who used to throw their rubbish over the back of our garden, do their clippings, and I reacted to that completely over the top. When they did it, I was ready to chop my way through the fence and go and have it out with them. Frightened the life out of my wife. She was like, "What are you doing?" But in my mind, I thought, if you don't get on top of this now, they're going to treat you like this forever. And so I had a hammer. I put another hammer down there, and I thought, right, come round if you want to come round. Completely over the top. We were in a car once, and me and my wife, we were driving along, and someone stuck their middle finger up at her. It was a guy in a BMW parts van. Before Shelley could even react to say, that's a bit rude, I was actually out the car over there and trying to get into his van, and he locked the van, and he was really scared. And I thought to myself, what are you doing? Where's this going to go? You're going to have temporary pleasure at shouting with this guy or dragging him out of the van or hitting him, then you're going to get arrested. And I guess one of the things I learned in rehab, which I'm still trying to enact, is consequential thinking, trying to understand, if I do this, what's going to be the result? And I can play that forward in my head. When I was in treatment and when I first came out of treatment, I found it very hard to do that. I was the youngest in my family, and I was a boy. So in a Turkish family, if you've got two sisters and you're the boy and you're the youngest, you're valuable because you're a boy, and you're also valuable because you're the youngest. And so I was spoiled. My sisters must have gone through murders with me, kind of getting away with stuff. And what that place showed me is, you're just like anyone else. You got to earn privilege. You've got to. It doesn't just come of right. You don't just get it because you're a special little boy. So yeah, I grew up there, I think. I grew up in this place. As a 23-year-old, I think I was more like a teenager. And that place taught me how to work, how to get up early, how to look after myself, how to look after others. We had a group once, one of the teachings. One of the person that was doing the teachings, it was a guy called David Partington. And he asked us a question as a group. And it was a scriptural question, and he said, "When's a thief not a thief?" And we all looked at each other like, this is really easy, when you stop stealing. And then he read out a passage from the Bible, and I can't remember, I think it was in the New Testament, but he said, no, it's not when you stop stealing, it's when you work with your own hands and you can look after your own needs. and you can support your neighbour. You get a bit emotional from time to time, but that was like a standard that was beyond. People don't expect that kind of standard from people like me or people like us who have got a kind of past that's either traumatic or we've veered into behaviours that are unacceptable or not normal within society. So to suddenly have the bar raised, it was like, yeah, yeah. It's funny how even just recounting that moment takes me back to, wow, at the time that floored me. What he was saying was, there's a role beyond that. And actually part of your past, and this is what came out in conversations with him and with others at the place, it's not just about correcting your past, it's about using your past in some way to inform your future. And so if you've known what it's like to steal, it's not enough to just stop stealing. The thing we can aim at is working, taking care of ourselves, working with our own hands, and having enough left over for someone else that you might be helping. So there was they didn't define it as paying it forward, but what they defined it as was, you've got a role to play in society and in community, and you're capable of doing that. And I guess, their position was, we expect that of you. And so it made me look up, I guess. It made me find a different horizon. And there were lots of those moments within the Yeldal journey. And it was also a place of pain, because confronting yourself and what you've done and what's happened to you is not easy. So there were many times when we would be just doing ordinary things, but you'd really hate the place. You'd hate having to rake leaves, or you'd hate having to do kitchen duties, or whatever it was, because you really resented that you needed to look at yourself. You'd look at the rest of the world and you'd think, well, they don't have to do it. Just because I use drugs, why do I have to do it? Why can't I just be everyday folk? But I guess what they were doing was they weren't just aiming at a drug-free life. They were aiming at a life with purpose and with meaning. And over time, for me, that became aligning myself to their values, to their faith, taking that on board, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It sounds weird sometimes saying that, and as I've grown in my understanding of that personally, for my own, kind of pilgrimage, if you like, internal, not external. I've kind of tried to understand that more and more. But what it does is it doesn't force me to talk to other people about it. It forces me to talk to myself about it. I look at everyone else. I look at you. I look at the world from the inside out, and the world looks at me from the outside in, or maybe even just on the outside. But the person that I am today is different externally from the person that I used to be. Obviously, I'm a lot older. I mean, I got into treatment and recovery at the age of 23. I'm now 60. So there's been a whole lifetime of change and development. But essentially, I'm still the same person inside me looking out. And so I've still got those same insecurities, worries. I still have conversations with myself in my head. I sometimes hear my dad's voice in my head. I remember that being a frightening thing when my dad used to say to me quite a lot, "What's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing this, or why are you doing that? Or why are you behaving in that way?" And I used to think, there's nothing wrong with me. It's you lot, But I kind of grew up with this constant pounding of, What's wrong with you? And I know that that had an impact on me. And when my oldest son, I can't remember what age he was at, but I caught myself saying to him, what's wrong with you? And I could hear my dad's voice, and I thought, my dad's dead, so I can't go back to him and talk anything through. I have to have conversations with him in my head. And so I tried to nip that in the bud and thought, no, there's nothing wrong with him. He's just being a youngster. You know, the fears that I have, so when I look at myself, is I worry that some of the stuff that I went through when I was young, maybe for the reasons that, you know, there might be reasonable adjustments that I made based on the circumstances that I was in. So the upbringing I had to use drugs in the way that I did was reasonable. It was a reasonable act because the world that I lived in was a little bit mad and chaotic, and so using drugs gave me something. But as young people grow up, they might experiment and use drugs. Doesn't mean they're going to turn into what I was. And I guess one of the things I've become aware of myself is I can, if I'm not careful, I can project myself onto other people. And so if my son decides to smoke or experiment with drugs, I immediately go into overdrive and think he's going to become like me. He's going to start committing crime. He's going to start doing this. He's going to get arrested. He's going to ruin his life. And so the response is over the top. And actually the over the top response can trigger all sorts of other behaviours. So learning to keep control of myself has been difficult. It's one of the things that I'm trying to do more and more. I'm better and better at it. I can count to 10. Someone can say things to me that don't necessarily trigger an over-the-top response. There's something in me, and I think it goes back to before the drug use. And the reason for the drug use was that there was stuff in me that the drug use helped with. It quelled. And those things are still there. And I'm just not using drugs anymore. So when I'm in a situation where I'm a bit stretched in terms of my capability, let's say, or my time, my tendency is to look at myself and to be self-critical. That can be an asset as well. You know, sometimes you get people at work who just know their own minds and they're always right and they can give you an answer on the spot. I tend to, you know, kind of want to weigh things up a bit. So, you know, if I'm put in a position where I'm asked about something, I'll think about it. You know, I won't just jump in anymore. And that can be a real asset, you know, that people come to me and they say, I've got this problem or that problem. We'll discuss it, and usually the answer finds itself. If there's something that happens in the office, let's say, or in my life, because of my treatment background, and people in treatment who have gone through rehabilitation have learnt to look at themselves honestly. And so if something's going on, I look at myself and I think, have I done something here? You know, is there anything that I need to correct in me before I start looking at the other person or you or whoever? And yeah, I don't know how I've gone from a 23-year-old in rehab to someone who's 60 and is still working in the drug and alcohol field. Since, you know, I came out of rehab in 1988. Probably I've only had about 3 months of not working or being paid. I entered the drug field in 93. If I count Oxford City Council, that role, that was probably about 91, 92 I got that job, just as I was getting married. In fact, just as I got married in 92. How I've managed to stay in the social care and mainly drug and alcohol field since then, I don't know how I've done that, honestly. And it sounds like I'm I'm being falsely modest. There's several sides to the assets and liabilities that are within me, and I'm trying to work more on the assets. I'm trying, I've got a lot of good assets. Some of them I learned during drug use and committing crime. So one of the examples that I give sometimes, and I say this to myself as well, when I was committing crime, if I got together with other people who were committing crime and we plotted to commit a crime, that was criminal conspiracy. And you can get arrested for that, and I think it's a crime in and of itself. That's a real skill. It's just being used in a bad context. And now, instead of using that networking ability and ability to connect with people to commit crime, I would use that to plot good, to create a strategy or an organisation, or to help someone find their way along a kind of treatment path, to think logically about something. It's a real skill, but I used to use it in a really bad context. And so one of the things I've learned as I've kind of gone through this voyage of recovery and discovery is there's a lot of things in me that are good that I can repurpose in a different way, and they're assets. Even my former drug use and former criminal behaviour, having kind of come out into the world of work, I've worked in the drug and alcohol field, and that's a real asset. If you're talking to other people that have been where you've been, there's an instant connection there. If anything, I've had to curb disclosing that, because it can be a bit of a false flag. What you're doing is you're not helping that person, you're just telling them wonderful things about yourself, and so you're making yourself feel better rather than helping the person in front of you. So there's sometimes assets don't have to be advantages. There can be disadvantages to assets depending on how you use them. Someone said to me, at this time I was going to church and I was getting involved with different people. Whenever someone a bit kind of out of the ordinary came to church or came into my circle of friends, I would be the one that would get close to them, talk to them, or someone would say, you know what he's like. If he's drinking too much, maybe you can talk to him. And someone said to me one day, "You're really good at this. You don't shy away from people that other people might walk away from. And have you ever thought about doing drug work?" And I hadn't really. I'd thought about, kind of leaving rehab and becoming a criminal round here somewhere where I didn't have a drug habit on my back. There was no one that knew me. I thought I could rip it up round here. But drug work, I hadn't really thought about it. And I got a job in the place that helped me. This was 5 years after treatment. I went back to work at Yeldall Manor, and I worked as their admissions and referrals coordinator. By then I'd had a job, I'd had a business, trying to make a go of being an electrician on my own, in fact with a friend, like General Builders. And I'd had a job in housing benefit in Oxford because the builders failed and I needed to get a job. By then I was kind of hooked on working. I knew that I couldn't commit crime, so I needed to work. So I got a job. And I got a job as a housing benefit clerk at Oxford City Council. And it was a bit of a nightmare job, really. And I remember that it was one of the first times I felt I was able to tell the truth about who I was. I went for this job and it was down to me and someone else. I don't know who the other person was. And they said to me, "Why should we hire you as opposed to this other person?" And I said, "Well, I don't know about the other person." I said, "But I know what it's like, and I'm hoping I don't get emotional here. But I said, I know what it's like to come to you lot cap in hand because I've been homeless." Anyway, that lasted for a while, and then a job at the place that helped me came up, and I thought, I'd had the conversation about becoming a drug worker. So I went and I got the job, and it was good for a while. You know, I enjoyed working at Yeldal. It was weird being a staff member, because when you were a resident, you saw the staff members as almost demigods. They're just so with it and together, and then when you become a staff member and you see behind the scenes, it's a bit like the bit in The Wizard of Oz, you know, when they pull the curtain back, it's just an old man pulling some levers. And so suddenly I started to see the flaws in staff, and I just started to think, they're more screwed up than the residents. But somehow they're trying to keep it together and support and love these people and give them the treatment that they need to get better. But I was there for 5 years, and about 3 years in, I got a bit jaded, and I didn't really want to be there anymore. I felt like a cog in their sort of machinery, and I started to resent the residents. So I used to say, you know, when I went to Yeldal, if they'd have said to me the intake criteria for you to have a place here was, we need to chop your little finger off, I'd have put my hand out and said, chop it off then, because I don't really need it and I really want to be here. I want to sort myself out. But 3 months in, I'd have been moaning about the pasta, moaning about the food, moaning about work. And I started, about 3 years in, as a staff member, I started to see that in the residents, and it really used to grate on me. And at the same time, I used to see some of the flaws in the staff. And I remember probably in my 3rd or 4th year, I took a day off sick every month for 12 months. And I wasn't sick. I made up a physical ailment so that I could justify not going into work. And what it was is that it took me about a month to get to the end of my tether and not be able to cope. But it wasn't, you couldn't say, oh, my mental health's not well today, can I stay at home? That was just not a reality back then. So I'd feign illness. I got backache, I got the runs, I've had something dodgy, I can't come in. And so I took 12 days off in 1 year. And I realised at that point, I need to stop doing this and I need to get another job. Working for Smart, for me, was where it started. Yeldal was a bit of a... Yeldal, they kind of hired me because they knew me. I had no credibility with anyone else. And so my first job with them was great. But Smart was where I felt I got my first real start. Because convincing Phil to employ me was a mission. He interviewed me 3 times, and twice he said to me, we don't employ Bible bashers. And Ian Robinson, who was the false drugs coordinator at the time, was sitting in on the interview, but he wasn't allowed to speak. He was just sitting in. And I looked at him and I said, what are you, like the KGB officer in the corner? He can't talk to me like that. Why is he talking to me like that? And you're not challenging it. And he just laughed, and Phil laughed. And yeah, he said, we don't employ Bible bashers. And I thought, okay. I said, but I'm not just a Bible basher. You know, I'm a person, I've got lived experience. I've had this job for 5 years. I've done this, this, this and this. And in the end, after Mick took me out for about 3 coffees, he relented and he said, all right, let's employ him. Because Mick Madden, who's sadly passed away now, kept saying to Phil, I don't know what's wrong with him. There's nothing wrong with him. I've been out with him for coffee 3 times. You've interviewed him 3 times. Either employ him or don't employ him, but there's nothing wrong with him. And so he ended up employing me, and that was that, I guess. Most of my appeal is my experience. And so I don't know how I got the jobs that I got. What I did was I often started by reading. So the reason I know that there was a drug strategy called Tackling Drugs Together was because I read it. The reason I know that changed when we got a Labour government to Tackling Drugs to Build a Better Britain was because I read it. You know, I read it from cover to cover and I learnt the language. And so when I went for interviews, I'm sure that I was able to make people believe that I knew more than I actually did. Because does everyone read the strategies? Does everyone read the policy documents? I don't know. I did, because I felt so disadvantaged at the beginning that I need to have an advantage of some sort. And even if you're in a criminal background, deception is about helping people to believe a story that you're telling them. And so, you know, reading these strategies really helped me to be able to speak the language, and that helped me to get the jobs. And I did that for 3 years, I think, before a job in the prison service came up. And I thought, I'm going downhill. I've gone from working with the police to now thinking about working in prison. And it was a discussion with my wife. I saw the job in The Guardian, and I said, I can do this job now. I can do 80% of this job now. And she said to me, you always say that. You always think you can do things that you can't do. And I said, I'll show you. I'm going to apply for this job. And I didn't think I would get it. And again, in that, I was just trying to solve a problem. And the problem was, how can I get an interview? How can I get in front of these people and tell them about myself? And again, there was these moments in the process. I applied, I didn't hear anything for a while, and I thought, no, it's gone in the bin. And then I get an email, and I have to ring up, and before I know it, I'm going for interview. And I get to the interview, and it's in London. You get off at Westminster Tube, and you've got to walk past the Houses of Parliament, and you know there's Churchill on his statue. There's Oliver Cromwell in front of Parliament. You've got to walk round, and then you get to prison service headquarters and on Cleland Street, and the buildings are massive. And I feel tiny by the time I go into this interview, and I think there's no way they're giving me this job. And if they do, I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm overwhelmed. But something happens in the interview. I get to the interview, and no one has asked me whether I've got a criminal record. And so I feel guilty being in the interview, and I think when they find out, they're going to end it. So I thought I might as well end it now. And I'd prepared a letter. And so I said, before we get into this, can I just show you this letter? They'd asked me if I was a Freemason. They'd asked me if I was a member of a racist organisation, but they hadn't asked me if I had a criminal history or if I'd used drugs. I thought, well, maybe they're going to ask me in the future as part of the security check-in process, but I couldn't be sure. So I thought, I'll tell them now, get it out of the way. And I gave them the letter, and it had my criminal history, what I could remember, things that I'd gone to court for, the fact that I'd been in rehab for 2 years voluntarily, blah, blah, blah. And they read it, and they asked me some questions, and they said, yeah, we can carry on with the interview. And as if that wasn't enough, they then said to me, I'd done a lot of preparation for this, I had to give a presentation, and they said something about, so I'd done a presentation about how you can eradicate drugs from prison and how you can manage people who use drugs in prison through treatment. And so I'd prepared something, and then they said something like, it was a bit like one of the other interviews, like, why should we employ you? It's a bit like the housing job I went for. Why should we employ you over anyone else? And I said, well, the truth is, if you go to any London prison, you've got fences around the prison, you've got locks on all the doors. Only half the people who live there have got keys, the other half haven't. But you could go into any London prison today and you'd find someone on a mobile phone smoking a spliff. And I said, I don't know why you should employ me. I'm struggling as to why I would work for you, because the people that I work with, the police, think you lot are a joke. How can drugs and phones get into prisons? And that was my answer. I thought, there's no way going to give me the job anyway. I might as well tell them the truth. And one of the interviewers, the guy who turned out to be my line manager, said, I like this guy. He's telling us the truth. He said, we have got a drug problem in prisons. We have got phones in prisons. And then I went on to do more of my presentation and talk about how I might manage that within a prison setting. But my research was void of real experience of working in a prison. The last time I went into a prison was to visit my dad and to visit friends that had gone into prison. I'd never served a sentence myself, so I could have been talking out of the back of my head as far as they were concerned. But I got the job, and I remember thinking, wow. And I worked there for 5 years, and I loved it. It was one of the best jobs in the world, area drug coordinator for the 7 London prisons. in Henley they do something called Henley in Bloom, and as a town they try and compete with other towns to win this competition called not Henley in Bloom, but it's like a horticultural competition. Henley want to win it, and they had some people knocking doors around Gainsborough, where I live, which is a former council estate, and there was a councillor and a journalist, and I think there was a police officer there as well, and they were knocking on doors, and they knocked on this woman's door, and they were talking about Henley in Bloom, and she said, "Never mind Henley in Bloom, when are you going to deal with the drugs in Henley?" And Henley's like a sleepy little town known for the regatta, very, got a bit of a posh reputation, and she's calling them out on the drug problem in Henley. And so I didn't witness that, but someone told me about it. In fact, it was another police officer told me about it, and we spoke about it, and I said, well, why don't we do something? Normally, let's not add our voice to the complainers. Let's do something. And I was thinking about starting a group or, doing something. She agreed to maybe do something with me, but then she went off. She had a family emergency and I didn't see her for 3 months. So in that time, I was thinking about, well, what can we do? What would this group look like in Henley? And I was a freelance consultant at this point, and I went into town. So I wasn't working every day, and my days were varied. So I'd often go into town. I went into my local church. They had a coffee shop. So I'm sitting in there thinking, I wonder what this group could look like. And as I'm sitting in the coffee shop, I'm thinking a coffee shop would be nice. And so we started thinking about a recovery. I started thinking about a recovery cafe. And after that day, I spoke to others about it. I spoke to my wife, I spoke to my niece and some friends. And so we settled on the idea of a recovery cafe. The church had just done up their cafe, so it was a really nice space. And I approached them and said, can I rent this once a month commercially? I know I'm a member of the church, but if you let me just rent it commercially, we'd like to start a recovery cafe. And they gave me a great deal. It was like, £100, and we'll throw in the coffee as well. So once a month for £100, we opened a recovery cafe, and we'd pay someone 20 quid that night to serve the coffee as a barista, and we'd make our own cakes, or we'd buy them from a local shop. In Henley there's a shop called Cook, and they give 30% off for community initiatives. So they gave us 30% off their cakes, which were kind of top cakes really, and we made some as well, and we started this cafe every month, and the way we paid for it was, my consulting company at the time was called Green Apple Consulting, and I used to get about £1,500 a quarter in expenses, and so I took 1/4's expenses, and that funded the cafe for a whole year. During one of the cafes there was a local guy who'd been forced to come to the cafe by the local bobby, because he was on heroin, he's on methadone. Anytime anywhere in Henley got burgled, his door got kicked in, because it was usually him. And he was just years into methadone and into that life. He was still a youngish guy, and he came along. He was forced to come, and he sat among people in recovery while they were chatting. And at the end of the night, he said to me, Damien was his name, he said, Bubs, because they called me Bubble, Bubs. He said, Bubs, what do I need to do to get what they've got? And I said, I don't know. What are you prepared to do? And this guy went away and obviously thought about it, and he changed his life. He changed the world around him. He went to live in, I think he went to Wickham, he got into treatment in Wickham, he got help. And he started to turn his life around, and he's doing really well now. He's married, he's got a kid, and I thought at the time, if there was about 6 or 7 people around him, I thought, if 6 or 7 people just talking about their own life and their recovery can have an impact on one person, imagine if we had a conference and we got 100 people in recovery to come to Henley. Could we change the atmosphere in the town? And so we set up this conference, and we had hardly any money. My niece is a marketing person, and she said to me, she wanted to buy these lanyards, and they were £1 each. And I said, Jasmine, 100 lanyards, and if we need some spares, that's like 150 quid. We ain't got 150. I said, she said, what's the budget for the conference? And I said, it's not going to stretch to £1 a lanyard. You know, we might have 500 quid, but we've got to get food, and you know, we've got to pay for the rent of the hall. And she ended up using these like just paper sticky things that go on people's chests with their name on it. And so we did this budget conference, but the food was good. We involved everyone. We got all the mums involved, and they were cooking. My sister came down. She did some Turkish food, and we must have had, I mean, the speakers were Mark Gilman, and he was like the NTA recovery lead at the time, a woman called Kathy Gingell, who worked for the Centre for Policy Studies. Treff Lloyd Roberts came, he was the General Secretary of ISAC, which is the International Substance Abuse Coalition. Andy Partington from Yeldall Manor, he was their Chief Exec, came. Wendy, who was the Chief Exec of the Lee at the time, and we had all these other people. And it was a banging conference. It was really good. People said, I would have paid £300-400 for this in London and not batted an eyelid, and we did it for free. We didn't charge anything. We consumed the costs ourselves, and I don't think we paid anyone to speak, and we didn't pay anyone's travel or anything like that. But it went down really well. We videoed it and we put it out online, and we did them every year for I think about 4, maybe 5 years. One year, John Taylor came from Duran Duran and gave his recovery story, and Towards Recovery kind of came out of that. We did it for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, as a community organisation, paid for out of our own pockets. And then in 2017, we turned it into a community interest company, and I started bidding for a little bit of money from the Big Lottery Fund, from the Awards for All Community Fund. And we got, 8,000-9,000 a year for the next 4 years. I haven't put a bid in this year. And we've moved everything online. Prior to COVID, we had a good social media presence, but then COVID came and we shifted everything online quite easily. And now we have occasional face-to-face recovery cafes. We've been going now for 10 years. So we've gone beyond 10 years. We've got a website, we've got a Strava group, we've got touch points like a Facebook group, an Instagram page, all of those kind of free social media things. And what we do is we connect with people as best we can. We don't do assessments, we don't take anyone's information. It's all on a first name basis. People self-select if they want to come and be part of what we do. And when we met last Friday. We meet every 2 weeks now online. We get people turn up from all over the place. One guy turns up from the Wirral, someone from London, a few people from round here. During lockdown, we had whole rehabs logging in, and so, having a whole room full of residents looking at the camera, wanting to check in. And all we do is we have a check-in, we have a topic for discussion, and then we have a patch-up at the end and ask people what their plans are for the weekend. We usually do it on a Friday. I'm someone who says to themselves quite a bit, "God, that was lucky." But I've been lucky so many times that statistically, no one can be that lucky, if you know what I mean. So I must be doing something right, but I don't quite know what I'm doing right, other than trying to be me. If I try and be the person with the degree, with the qualifications, I fumble, because I'm not that person. And I got a friend, a guy called Neil McKegney, colleague, friend, and I remember him saying to me once, they were bidding for £1 million Department of Health research study on drug recovery wings in prisons, and it was Neil McKegney's Centre for Drug Misuse Research, as it was then, York University and Cambridge University bidding for this £1 million contract. And Neil rang me and asked me some questions. I didn't really understand the questions, and I said, "Neil, you lot are so clever, there's nothing I can add to what you're doing." And he insisted on sending me their bid, and so I read it, and I thought, well, they've missed out anything on the drug action team structure, anything on the commissioning structure. They haven't mentioned diversity, they haven't mentioned this, and so I did him a one-pager of what I thought would improve their bid. And I ended up working with them for 3 years. They kept the £1 million. They gave me about £10,000 over the 3 years to go backwards and forwards to London to meetings, and I helped them with some developing some of the questions. But I don't know how I get into these circumstances. The way I try and rationalise it and understand it is through the faith that I've aligned myself. There's a bit in the Bible that says that God takes, I can feel myself getting a little bit emotional as well, so give me a minute. God takes the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. And I feel like one of those foolish things that in and of myself, I couldn't have organised this life for myself. Something greater than me, I felt, was helping me. And I was getting in my own way, left, right and centre. But somehow, here I am, I'm 60. I ain't got that much career future left, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. I have no retirement plan, so I'm going to keep working one way or another as long as I'm upright. And so, but somehow I've managed to pick my way through this journey and pick up experiences along the way that have been valuable to others. So, you know, I got this job at Bracknell Forest Council. Again, I felt I was lucky. Someone else got the job and they declined it. So it came back on the market and I went for it. And my predecessor is someone that I know. I said to Gillian, is it a real opportunity, or have you got someone in mind? If you've got someone in mind, I won't even bother applying. But if you haven't, I kind of feel like I've been consulting for long enough now. I want a proper job and I want to be part of a team again, because I was a solo consultant. And she said, no, it's a straight up, you know, best candidate's going to get it. And no favouritism. If you go for it, go for it. And I went for it and I got it. And I was chuffed to bits. And even now, I sometimes, they've given me a coach at work, someone who works with me to help me in terms of my role. And I say to her sometimes, you know, I'm full of self-doubt. I'm full of worry about whether I'm doing it right or whether I'm good enough. And she'll say to me things like, well, how did you get this job? And I say, well, I applied. And did you write an application? Yeah, I wrote an application. Did you do an interview? Yeah, I did an interview. She said, did you do a presentation? I said, yeah, I did a presentation. Were you security checked? Did you have a DBS check? Yes, I did all that. And she said, well, do you think the people that hired you are stupid and wouldn't know the real thing if they saw it? And I said, no, you know, they're clever people, they're senior people. And she said, well, why can't you just trust that you know what you're doing?